We've been listening to President Obama there at the United Nations Climate Summit, talking about a number of topics. Obviously, the main focus of his visit there is to discuss climate change, and we heard him talk about the urgency to tackle the problem. At the end there, he talked about how this is a very difficult issue and how it is a problem that will span many generations. But he was also striking an optimistic note, saying that he thinks this is a problem that can, in fact, be tackled. And he pointed to the fact that there were many nations there, 180, he said, that have come together in France, and he said that that was a sign in and of itself of progress. He also, though, talked about ISIL. That obviously is on the minds of many people there in France. It was just 2 weeks ago that those attacks happened there. And the president said at the outset, certainly this was a remarkable display of resolve, having this climate change conference go forward. He said when he arrived there in Paris, the first place he visited was the Bataclan Theater.
That's right. He called climate change an economic and security imperative that we have to tackle now. As Elaine was saying, he did point out that he thinks that they can solve this. However, the big issue for him now, and he called it a huge issue, is the pace at which they do so. He was just commenting that 2 years ago, if anybody had mentioned that they would bring 180 countries together to try to tackle this global problem, they would have been laughed at. But here they are in Paris at this 2-week conference trying to do just that. He also talked about philanthropist and former Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates. Yesterday they met and talked about that public-private partnership that could play a pivotal role in all of this. Bill Gates coming out, getting 28 other philanthropists and entrepreneurs together to try to tackle climate change, which could also make a real dent in this issue, which is something we haven't seen before. Obviously, going forward now, getting the poorer countries like India on board. They're the third biggest generator of fossil fuel after China and the United States. Our Margaret Brennan is traveling with the president. She is in Paris. She was just listening in to the president. Margaret, what stood out to you the most?
Well, you know, President Obama is clearly very comfortable discussing this climate change deal, in part because it is such a high priority for him. He sees this as part of his legacy. But there were as many questions about that as there were about the war on terror, Mr. Obama's version, and how he's targeting ISIS. On that, we didn't really hear anything new from the president. He said he's been trying to convince Turkey to close its border, to stop foreign fighters from flowing in, and he met yet again with Russia's Vladimir Putin yesterday and was unsuccessful, despite pleading with him for the second time in 2 weeks to stop bombing U.S.-backed rebels and start targeting ISIS. On the climate change issue, President Obama said, you know what, this agreement needs to get done. Washington needs to get behind me, and said he predicts that a Democrat will follow him in office and hold up whatever America does get brokered here in terms of this deal. The context to that is there is concern among many congressional Republicans about what is being negotiated here in Paris, and Republicans have threatened to withhold funding for any climate change pact if one is hammered out over the next 2 weeks. President Obama said, well, you know what, I think that's not going to be an issue. The funding will be there, and this deal is going to get done.
Margaret, he was also asked about a domestic issue. Interesting to watch his reaction to that. The shooting in Colorado Springs on Friday at the Planned Parenthood clinic. What did he say about that?
President Obama said his heart goes out to the victims there, and he did two things. He defended Planned Parenthood, which he said provides health care to women, does some important work, but then opened up in saying, if you want to debate abortion, you can have that conversation, but don't make the issue of what Planned Parenthood does conflated with the question of abortion, saying there, undercutting perhaps what some have speculated might be the motive of the shooter in that Colorado killing spree. He also then segued into, once again, a plea for more gun control or some form of review of regulation of gun ownership. He said, standing here in Paris, you know, these kind of mass shootings don't happen in other countries. And what we expect from the president is perhaps in the next few weeks to see more executive actions or possibly a bigger push for further gun regulation that he has been unsuccessful with so far. There have been so many mass shootings, as the president noted, during his term, and he thinks before he leaves office that he can at least tighten some of the existing laws, close some loopholes, even though he does not expect to be able to get an overhaul or really threaten gun ownership, as some congressional Republicans have worried he would do.
And Margaret, before we say goodbye, just one, as we go back to climate change for a moment, here we are, we have the 180 countries all there. The big obstacle now is compromise. So what is the likelihood that they can all get on board? And even if they do, will it make a significant difference going forward?
That is a huge question that we may not get a real answer to for years, because what's being negotiated here is really going to rely on countries living up to their own promises. Remember, this isn't going to be legally binding. It's not a treaty. There's no enforcement per se, though obviously the world will be watching each other to see if they live up to the cuts in greenhouse gas emissions that many countries are expected to sign on to. The biggest offenders here, of course, are the United States and China. They're the two of the world's biggest polluters. So when you do hear the president promise that the U.S. is going to cut back, and China has said they know they need to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions because of their huge pollution and smog problems there, you can expect that at least you will see that minimum pledge. But the president also said, listen, I know this is not going to solve climate change. We are just really trying to sort of limit some of the damage, because as you raised in your question, this 3.6 degree Fahrenheit sort of not cap but limit in global warming that they're trying to negotiate here in Paris isn't going to make a huge dent in the problem, but it is a starting point, and we'll see whether the countries can actually get that done. Before he gave that press conference you just saw, President Obama did speak with a handful of countries, many of them island nations, who are literally at risk, he says, of disappearing off the map because they see rising sea levels, all of that a result of global warming, and he says this global instability and threat to the world of climate change.
Still a lot of questions about whether or not an agreement can happen and whether or not it would be effective ultimately. Margaret Brennan traveling with the president for us. Margaret, thank you so much for your report.